April 13th, 1997, the very first Extreme Championship Wrestling pay-per-view titled Barely Legal went on the air live from the corner of Swanson and Rittner Streets in South Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, in a converted warehouse that had been turned into a bingo hall that had been turned into a wrestling arena. 20 years ago today, one of the most interesting and unique professional wrestling events of all time took place. Certainly one of the most emotional, and it is an event that still, 2 decades later, people talk about. In this very special PW Insider documentary-style presentation, we are going to look back at Barely Legal, the events leading up to it, the personalities involved, and the aftermath of what was a most memorable and entertaining professional wrestling event. My name is Mike Johnson. I'm going to be your narrator as we go through and explore some of the history of ECW and look back at Barely Legal. However, I'm going to be joined by a number of different personalities who not only worked the show, but also worked behind the scenes or were there witnessing the event live. So I'm going to introduce you to a lot of names and a lot of voices, some of which you might know and be familiar with, some of which may be new to you. So stay tuned. We're going to have a most interesting look back at ECW's Barely Legal 20 years later. ECW Barely Legal was originally scheduled to take place on March 30th, 1997, but before that calendar year even began, the show was postponed or canceled, depending on who tells the story. Questionable concerns about ECW as a company and the content that they were producing led to the major pay-per-view providers at that point, Request TV and In Demand, opting to not carry the show. It appeared ECW's hope of getting on pay-per-view was at the very best postponed, at the very worst, a closed door. In Demand would not carry ECW's Barely Legal when it was rescheduled for April. Request TV, however, did. And a big part of it was due to the voice of the fans, who began a letter writing and email campaign and all sorts of other movements to try and mobilize the ECW audience to request the show. Strictly ECW, a New York City-based group that helped ECW get back on the Madison Square Garden network after they were canceled from that cable outlet, began mobilizing fans to push the pay-per-view outlets to carry ECW Barely Legal. Utilizing voicemail hotlines and the online medium, Strictly ECW played a major role in getting Request TV to reconsider. Tony Lewis, the head of Strictly ECW, talks about that time period and why he stepped forward and jumped into the fray.
Funny thing is, when we helped ECW get back on TV in New York, I figured that was it. I was done. I was going to go back to being a fan, and all of that went into obscurity. And then the pay-per-view was canceled, and I just jumped right back in it. Looked at it at with a national scope, learning what we learned from, what we did in New York, and, how can we do this? And, we found out who to write to, and that's basically it. We took what we learned in New York, and extended it to a national scope, and that was it. Basically, simply put.
Beth Tutt at Request TV was an important part of ECW getting back on pay-per-view.
Our contact there was Beth Tutt. Beth Tutt is a big wrestling fan, and she understood what ECW was about, and she knew that ECW was professional wrestling. She knew that it wasn't this offshoot of UFC and this human cockfighting thing. She understood what it was from the start. So it was important to have an ally like that in that office that would fight for the company. And basically, we just hit him with a bunch of letters, hit him with a bunch of phone calls. And I think the most important thing about all the campaigns that we ran is that it changed the perception of the wrestling fan to people in the corporate office. There's a stereotype of the average wrestling fan, and we told our followers and the people who are going to help us with this campaign to write thoughtful letters. You don't want to write a bunch of letters saying that if you don't put it on, I'm going to do this and I'm going to do that. A whole bunch of ranting and raving. These were well thought out letters that follow the guideline that we put out, but individual people put their own spin on it, and Beth Tut credited us basically largely in part for getting the pay-per-view rescheduled.
The pay-per-view was indeed rescheduled, but there were a lot of battles still to be fought. Pay-per-view companies did not want the ECW arena to be the origination of the barely legal pay-per-view. Tommy Dreamer talks about ECW getting kicked off pay-per-view, and Paul Heyman, despite getting back on, fighting to have that show held in what basically amounted to a converted warehouse in the middle of South Philadelphia.
Leading up to it, we had all these. Back then, that's how you made your next level money, was all from pay-per-view. And for us to finally clear this hurdle, to actually get on pay-per-view, we were supposed to be on every pay-per-view company. Everything happened, and then a tape was sent to one of the pay-per-view distributing companies, because I believe at the time there was only two, of the mass transit incident, and we got kicked off of pay-per-view even before we even got on it. And then we had a fight to get on, so we only carried in about half the homes that we were supposed to, and like all the pay-per-view company did not want us to do it at the ECW arena. To his credit, Paul Heyman said, if these people have supported me my entire company, if I do it anywhere else, I'll be disrespecting them. And so that's why he fought to do it at the ECW arena, which was an amazing call.
That wasn't the only battle Paul Heyman was fighting. Pay-per-view producers and pay-per-view distributors wanted to bring in more established production people, while Paul Heyman wanted his usual crew of Ron Buffone and Charlie Bruzzese to head the production. In the end, Heyman did win that battle, and Ron Buffone was the director of ECW Barely Legal, directing the first ever ECW live broadcast. Ron Buffone remembers getting the chance to do the pay-per-view and Heyman's loyalty at the time.
Well, I got to tell you that loyalty went a long way. I was an unknown entity. ECW was an unknown product. Everyone wanted to see it go to pay-per-view, and the pay-per-view people certainly wanted their own people in that seat. And Paul Heyman, his credit, basically said Ron Buffone is the person that got us to that dance, and Ron Buffone earned that seat, and I won't do it without him.
Another change pay-per-view producers attempted to push upon ECW was removing Joey Styles from commentary as the solo announcer. They wanted to give Joey a color commentator. Joey on ECW television had for the most part always called ECW alone, and Paul Heyman fought for Styles to be the lone announcer at the first pay-per-view, eventually getting his way, although Tommy Dreamer did appear for one match, didn't really say much. We'll talk about that in a little bit. Joey Styles here talking about some of the pressure leading into the first live pay-per-view he ever called and what the experience was like for him trying to get through.
Well, first and foremost, I have to thank Paul because he really fought the pay-per-view companies who were insisting on having at least two announcers because that's what everyone else did. And on top of all the other problems we had with the pay-per-view companies, Paul insisted that ECW be done the way it had always been done, with him at the helm, which is just me as an announcer. Once I got up to the broadcast position over the front door, I was just in the zone, and I'm always like that. Once I'm announcing, I'm fine. All the pressures leading up to the night and that day and the preparation, which you helped me with, thank you. All of that goes away once the show starts, and I'm left to do my thing. It's just the fastest 3 hours in the world.
In the weeks leading up to ECW's first pay-per-view, something unthinkable would happen if you consider the history of professional wrestling. World Wrestling Federation's Monday Night Raw began plugging Barely Legal. ECW talents appeared live on Monday Night Raw for wrestling matches and interacting with Jerry the King Lawler, all in pursuit of helping to promote the April 13th pay-per-view. ECW founder Tod Gordon talks about why the anti-establishment promotion ended up working with the WWF and how he felt about it at the time.
Well, my thoughts at the time were that we were selling out a little bit by Paul dealing with them because I felt that WWE, or if they're WWF at the time, I'm not even sure, our whole purpose was to show that they were the they were the establishment, we're the anti-establishment. To work in conjunction with them, to me, was a kind of a little bit of a slap in the face to the fans. Even though I understood the necessity of it to get more people aware of the product on a national basis.
Taz weighs in on why he felt WWF helped ECW at the time and his own memories of working Monday Night Raw.
I did, because in essence we helped them. I don't think WWF or WWE just helped us. I think we helped them too, because they were kind of a little flat, to be honest with you. They needed something to make them feel edgy, or something. They needed something to make them feel like something cool was happening. And I think we brought that to them. And we also got from them was a much bigger awareness to the masses of who the heck are these ECW guys. I remember that when we did the show at the Manhattan Center, that we basically came in as a group. I've talked about this on my show. We dressed in, sweatsuits, with the ECW logo on it, with our names on them, and kind of a Japanese promotion feel. And I remember Paul Heyman saying that Vince McMahon was so impressed with that, and that's cool. I remember that. I remember us having our own locker room, and we were kind of they kept us away from everybody for the most part. You know what I mean? We kind of would just they took care of us. They did the right thing, but I think they were very, loaded with hospitality for sure for us. And all the production people who want to know different camera shots and all this kind of jazz, they were all really cool. So they treated us great. Honestly, they did. I thought it was awesome. I thought it was a great night for us.
Bubba Ray Dudley, who appeared on those Monday Night Raw episodes leading into Barely Legal, talks about why it happened and what his memories were of ECW's involvement with WWF.
In 1997, I believe that was the year when ECW invaded Raw. If you're Vince McMahon and you own the WWE and you're hearing these chants of ECW every night in your arenas, at your TV shows, at your live events, people holding up ECW signs, you got to be thinking to yourself, who the hell is this ECW? What the hell is this ECW? And why are people chanting it at my shows? Now, Vince knew all about ECW because he knew Paul, and he was helping Paul, or whatever the story is. Paul and Vince had a relationship. And Vince was smart enough to see that this ECW was garnering some steam and was getting some exposure. So Vince put ECW on Monday Night Raw to help spike the rating. And plus, it also gave ECW the rub so more eyes could get on the product. It was a very exciting night. I remember being in the Manhattan Center for the first time and, seeing all these, WWE stars and wishing, man, I can't wait to be in this company one day. All of the ECW guys are dressed in tracksuits, and we looked like a team and a unit. And I know the guys in the WWE locker room had never seen anything like that before. So going back and watching it, it was a groundbreaking night for ECW.
The Blue Meanie gives his memories of finding out that he's going to work the Raw taping as part of the BWO, and his insight into that night at the Manhattan Center in New York City.
It was amazing to find out that we were actually going to appear on WWE television. The week before we invaded Raw, Jerry the King Lawler had mentioned, the ECW and challenged us to appear next week on the program. So that following weekend at the ECW events, Paulie pulls us aside and says, we're booked for Monday Night Raw that following Monday. And just the anticipation, it was like waiting for Christmas. It's something we had already, you always want to, work for the best company in the world, and the best company in the world was WWE. And if they could help ECW get to that next step, get us some more eyeballs on our product, then that's awesome. That's so cool of Vince and WWE to do. But just the anticipation of waiting for Monday to come, making the drive from Philly to Tommy Dreamer's house in New York, and then we all made a caravan from Tommy Dreamer's house down to the Manhattan Center, and then showing up, and there's the Raw set live and in living color, something I'd seen on TV all these years. It was amazing. And then just the fact that we had the BWO was the first ones to appear in a match on Raw, and that we had a unique entrance, that we weren't going through the gorilla position, we were going through the crowd, which meant we had to go through essentially the command center where all the video screens were and stuff like that, and waiting for the cue. And I was just nervous from nerves alone. I was winded from nerves alone even before we went out there. So when the music hit and we hit that crowd, you could tell we were just so amped that a lot of people ribbed Stevie, because you could see him kind of shove me out of the way to get to the ring, because we're all just so excited. And if you look at that crowd, there's a ton of BWO shirts, and I definitely think the BWO made its mark on when ECW invaded Raw.
Indeed, as it turns out, the quarter hour featuring the BWO scored a 2.7. The previous quarter hour before the BWO, 1.9. So right then and there shows the interest that the average consumer or pro wrestling fan at the time had in Extreme Championship Wrestling. Which leads us now to the innovator of violence, Tommy Dreamer, who on that Monday Night Raw defeated Devon Dudley, giving some of his first-hand insight into ECW's relationship with WWF and appearing on Monday Night Raw to help promote ECW's Barely Legal.
My memories of working Monday Night Raw leading up to all that, man, I got a lot of memories of all that stuff. I remember what was most impressed by Vince McMahon is we all wore those track suits, hence what NXT wears today. And Vince probably said it like 5 to 8 times about the track suits, and like that we look like a team, because we all were at that Manhattan Center. We all dressed in, the track pants and the ECW jackets. We all entered that building together as a team. And I think that was the most impressed that Vince was. I remember the locker room wasn't the nicest, basically because they were afraid we were taking their jobs, and the usual paranoia that sets in. And I remember that Raw when we took over was great. Me and Devon got to wrestle. Sandman did a run-in when we took over Raw. It was a total different night. But, in hindsight, you could basically say that kind of started to change the flow of the Monday Night Wars, in the sense of anything could happen on Raw with, the ECW guys invaded, and I think started, a little bit of a switch, and, started a lot different era in the Monday Night War games, as well as the overall what's going on in WWE at the time. What was told to us was this was just a short-term thing done because, we're trying to get more exposure to more eyes on the. Don't really think that was the case. That's more of a question for Paul, but, as time told, Paul was, kind of in. So that is that.
While the relationship between WWF and ECW would continue to deepen in the months and years ahead, leading eventually to WWE purchasing ECW out of bankruptcy and launching their own version of the company, all eyes in 1997 were on Barely Legal. The night before Barely Legal, ECW paid tribute to Terry Funk at a special dinner. A number of ECW talents, and even Barry Blaustein, scriptwriter at the time and future director of Beyond the Mat, was chronicling the entire weekend for the Terry Funk portion of that documentary, which would be released in 1999, paid tribute and gave speeches about the Funker. Tommy Dreamer was in charge of producing this event and making it happen, and Dreamer, usually very cool and collected, usually speaking to everybody with a slow monotone, was extremely nervous about the tribute dinner to Funk. Dreamer remembers why he was so nervous and looks back upon that evening, the night before Barely Legal.
First of all, I don't remember why. I want to say, like always, all the BS going into it. I think we had lost a venue, and we had to scramble to get it. And, everything means everything to me, and I am a stickler for details. And when stuff like that happens, and plus, I really did think that maybe it was coming to the end of the line for Terry, just because, hey, it's Terry, but hey, I just had him at my own House of Hardcore show, and I still think it was the end of the line for Terry then. So he's the greatest worker of all time.
The night was ended with Paul Heyman giving an amazing speech about Terry Funk. This audio will now pick up, and I apologize for the quality, my original, not even a digital recording, a tape recording of that speech, picking up from the point where Paul is talking about being on the road with Terry Funk while they both worked for World Championship Wrestling. It's a long speech, but to set the stage for what Barely Legal was to be and what inspired ECW itself, it's a very interesting speech to listen to. So please indulge us and enjoy this speech from Paul Heyman.
I rode with him for the next week, and a week later is when he broke his tailbone. And this is where the story gets heavy. And this was the story of ECW. Terry broke his tailbone in Macon, Georgia. And I was fortunate enough to ride with him to Savannah that night. And I had heard stories about his toughness, and I had heard stories about how raw-boned he was. And he's in the car, and I'm looking over, and I saw tears going down his face, and he wouldn't acknowledge it. I said, Jesus, man, he's in pain. And he wouldn't acknowledge it. And right before he pulled him to sit down, he turned to me and goes, I'm goddamn hurt. Fuck, I'm hurt. And this is 3 weeks before the Great American Bash in Baltimore with him and Flair. And it scared me because I never heard Terry Funk acknowledge he was hurt. He was hurt. He broke his ass. Literally broke his ass. He broke his tailbone. So I took him to the hospital the next morning, and he didn't want to go. And I said, Terry, you got to go. I don't know. I said, you got to go. I took him to the hospital, and they x-rayed him. The doctor came in the room, and he said, Mr. Funk, you have a broken sacrum. You've broken your tailbone. You'll be okay. You'll be back in the ring in about 9 months to a year. And he says, I have a match on pay-per-view in 3 weeks. And the doctor says, if I have to admit you in this hospital, you don't have a match in 3 weeks. Forget it. In a year, maybe. Not now. And when the doctor left the room, I looked at him, and he was devastated. And I said, it's the pain. He goes, no. I said, it's the fact that you can't wrestle. He said, no. I said, is it because you think they're going to screw you over? He said, no. I said, what is it? And he said, there are people who in 3 weeks from now are paying to see me work with Ric Flair. And they're expecting a hell of a match. I'll be goddamned if a doctor or a broken ass or anybody on the face of this planet short of God himself is going to stop me from getting into that ring in Baltimore and giving the people the show that they paid to see. Man had an elbow that was puffed out to here. They drained it. His knees were swollen. He was wearing knee braces. They were working him on the road 34 straight days that month. Double shots against Sting, against Eddie Gilbert, against the Steiner brothers. Every baby face in that promotion was programmed against him, and they were drawing money for the first time. He was carrying the promotion on his back. He broke his ass, and the only thing that was going through his mind was the fact that the people paid to see him do his thing, and he would be damned if anything would stop him. That night, I called my father on the phone. My father, who is one of the hardest working men I've have known. I said, Dad, I met somebody who has that same work ethic. I met somebody who loves what he does. I met somebody who takes such pride in what he does and the fact that people have believed in him, that he cares that much that he'll make this type of sacrifice for the people who paid to see him. On that night in 1989, I prayed that I would find one, let alone a dressing room full of wrestlers, who would have that same work ethic, who would take that tradition to the next level. And I looked around that dressing room in WCW, and there's no need to mention those names because it's not their night, it's his. But the fact is that there were very few guys in that dressing room that had that work ethic. There were a lot of guys that, I got a cold, I'm off for a week. Hey, I got an ingrown toenail, I need a month off. He didn't take it. They forced him not to work on TV that night. They forced him not to work for the next week, and then he put himself back in the ring 8 days later. And he had a match with Flair on pay-per-view that, to me, to this day, was Flair's best match, with the exception of your I Quit match with him. The moral of the story is that when you look around in ECW, what you see is a tribute to Terry Funk. Because the criterion to work here is the willingness to work through an injury like that. The criterion to work here is to have that work ethic. The criterion to work here is not charisma, is not size, is not marketability. The criterion to work here is the first thing I look for in somebody, is work ethic. And I learned that work ethic. I idolized that work ethic. And we built a dressing room filled with that work ethic because of the example that has been set and was set since 1989 by Terry Funk. He set that example. This dressing room is a tribute to him. When Gary Wolf comes back in the ring from a broken neck and never once bitched about it, that's a tribute to the work ethic that was brought to the next. When Taz comes back from a broken neck last year, or 2 years ago, and he came back early because he wanted to get back in the ring, that's a tribute to the work ethic of Sheldon. When Sabu got dumped on his head by Chris Benoit and they said, you need to take a couple months off, and he goes, like that, I got a match in 2 weeks. That's a tribute to the work ethic that we would show up on Thursday. I work in that studio with two of the hardest working people I have ever been fortunate enough to work with in my life, in Ron and Charlie. Every Tuesday morning at 4 a.m., and every Monday night at 1 a.m., and every Tuesday night when we're all collapsing and dropping dead, they never complain. And they never, they do sometimes on Wednesday, but they never bitch about it when we're doing the job. And they don't bitch about it when we're doing the job, because when I asked them about it, they said, hey, look at your dressing room, man. Look, would the boys complain? Do the boys bitch? Do the boys not take advantage of the opportunity just to work? We were shown the way by one man. We were shown the way by a man who took it upon himself to get back in the ring after he literally broke his ass for this business. I look around at the guy that he handpicked to be his protege. And I wonder where Tommy Dreamer gets his work out. Dreamer! This up by telling you something else. If you want to understand how special this is for all of us, if you want to understand what tomorrow and tonight and this man means to us, I give you the following examples. Just so that you know, on a personal aside, when I left WCW, I swore I'd change my life around. I said, I'm going to live an ethical life. I want good karma. I want to be a different person than the other people in this business besides Terry that I have met. And as ethical as sometimes I think I am, and sometimes as moral as I think I am, this guy is a yardstick of which I can never measure up to. If you knew the ethics of Tommy Dreamer, you understand. That have thanked Tod and I, thank Tod and me, and when you think about how we have honesty in promotion, how we don't false advertise, how we try to be honest to our fans, there's a guy here in the show tonight that Terry handpicked to be the guy that carries his torch. And that's the guy that I look at as my ethical guidelines, as the guy that I look up to for his ethics, as the guy that I look up to because when I'm not sure which direction to go in, he always does the righteous thing. He always helps out the other person. If you knew the efforts that Tommy and Beulah and Debbie and Michael and everybody put into this night, if I'm with everybody else, so please understand this is hard. If you knew what Tommy has done for tonight, and Beulah and Michael and Debbie and Trish and everybody, if you knew what they put into this night, and this is what I'm getting to. He's not nervous about tomorrow night. It's just another night at the office, man. It's just another. I mean, I've been crying and yelling and screaming and climbing up the walls about this pay-per-view. And to Tommy, Mr. Cool, hey, just another night at the office, all right? Nothing stopped. Just another night. We're gonna do our thing. We're gonna be fine.
Just another 5 tables.
But God help the person that was going to do something wrong with this banquet. And, hey, what are you doing? Did you spell it right? Did you have the button on TV? Did you have the break right? Did you put down the phone number? I mean, he's driven me up a fucking wall. Because he's been nervous about it. I've never seen him nervous about anything. I've never seen his hand shake. Never. Nothing has ever intimidated him until this banquet. He wanted it to be special. Because he wanted one man tonight to know what his contributions have meant to us. Not just to the wrestling industry. We're going to be selfish tonight. He wanted Terry Funk to know what he has done for us. What he has done for ECW. What he's done to the individual performers. I'll ask you this. How many of you knew Taz was married? Hey, you know that lady over there?
No woman behind every man.
That's his wife. He goes straight back to his room and he gets on the phone every night with that woman because that's the type of husband that he is, and he has never discussed publicly the fact that there's a man behind the image of Taz. But he didn't care tonight to reveal that. He didn't mind that you see him sitting next to his wife. Do you know why? Because he wanted his family to pay tribute to this man. Yeah. He wanted himself. He wanted his wife to see what a special man we all get to work with. He wanted to be able to go home in a couple of weeks and say, hey, honey, Terry Funk was in our dressing room tonight, and have someone else besides a wrestler understand the honor that it is when you were in the same dressing room as Terry Funk. The dignity that it bestows upon us to be in the same dressing room as a Terry Funk. What it means to us all collectively and individually to stand and sit in the same dressing room as a Terry Funk. And although others may not understand what a great honor it is, to me it's like being in the presence of a pope. To me it's like getting an audience with the president. To me there is no greater honor than being allowed to stand before you tonight and say that this product here has been endorsed by the hardest working man I've ever had the honor of sitting in a dressing room and looking at. Very fun. You fans who are here tonight and have paid to be part of this, keep this in mind. In 1989, when he worked with Ric Flair on the biggest pay-per-view in the history of Turner Broadcasting, brought his wife. There have been several matches in Terry Funk's career when she's brought a daughter, maybe both, not just his wife. And I can't recall a time when Terry Funk felt compelled enough by any given night, any given audience, or any given group of people that he felt it would be worthy to bestow upon us the honor of bringing his entire family. Last year when we were heading into the November to Remember, I sat down with Tod. I said, Tod, what do you think? Should we go for it? Should we do it? Can we do it? What do you think? Pay-per-view? It's time. This company's ready, the boys are ready, the people are ready, the audience is ready. It's there for us. Let's go and do it. And I said, Tod, we got to build it on somebody. It can't just be the whole ECW concept. There has to be someone that leads us to the promised land. There has to be somebody that is the shining example of if this is what you're about, you will achieve your goals in life. We looked at each other, and it didn't take but half a second. We knew who the man was that we should build this around. We knew the storyline that had to be told. And we knew the man that this pay-per-view should go down in history as a tribute to. I thank you all tonight for coming out, honoring this man. I thank you all tonight for your support in this product that is a tribute to this man. I thank you all tonight for the audience that you have given us for tomorrow's show. Because if this show is what I think it will be, and if my dressing room can put in the performance and show the work ethic that I know my guys can give you, it's not just a tribute to the audience. It's not just a tribute to themselves. It's not just a display of how hard they work. I swear to God that I mean this from the bottom of my heart. Tonight and tomorrow, especially the work ethic that will be displayed by that dressing room tomorrow, is a tribute to one man who showed us the way, who showed us the work ethic that we all strive to live up to. And that man, ladies and
the days leading up to ECW Barely Legal were not only stressful for everybody in the company, but Paul Heyman himself. Harry Slash, a.k.a. Harry Grivas, tells the story of exactly how insanely busy and overworked ECW staff really was.
Paul Heyman did not sleep in 3 days. I did not sleep in 2 days because we had a very limited time to not only put together the Extreme theme, but to master Perry Saturn and Cronus's music for the Eliminators, to completely master Path of Rage for Taz, because certain things are done differently for live as they are for broadcast. It's a different way of mixing for broadcast than you mix for just a CD or live sound. And in between recording at the studio, I would end up running to Ron Buffone's studio where they were putting together the video packages and playing tapes for Paul and going back and forth. I also had to come up with a couple of other tunes that ended up not being used for Taka Michinoku's contingent and Sasuke's people. But they ended up bringing their own music from Michinoku Pro, so that was a load off my mind because those songs were pretty terrible, to be honest with you. But everybody had to arrive in Philly. It was the night before, so we all had to be in Philly on Friday night, which meant very limited time for absolutely everybody. Like Ron, Charlie, and Paul could have used that extra day and a half to really tweak video packages and what have you. So Paul literally had these guys working 8-hour shifts. Ron would sleep while Charlie would work. Charlie would sleep while Ron would work. And Paul just never went to sleep. Every so often he'd say, let me close my eyes and think about this. And 10 minutes would go by where he was in a sound sleep. He'd power nap and wake up. It's like, all right, let's put this, and this scene together. There was a lot of stuff that had to be, other stuff for pre-production going into the show that had to be prepared. The motorcycle helmets, riot gear, that was forgotten about until the last minute. There were a few other last-minute things that had to be procured somewhere or another that have escaped me. But if you look at the Terry Funk Banquet and you see Paul Heyman's eyes are bloodshot red, my eyes are bloodshot red, Debbie's eyes are bloodshot. We all look like we're stoned. No, we weren't. Everybody was just absolutely exhausted from the production work and the prep work for going into that Sunday. I don't think anybody actually slept until Sunday night. It was working on pure adrenaline. There were a lot of other people involved with the production of the show, like Mikey Whipwreck and Tammy. Had a lot to do with the backstage stuff going on. I do remember that Mikey at one point was calling sound cues. He was injured at the time. And I believe Tammy was calling camera cues for the live feed at one point. I don't remember if they did it throughout the entire night.
ECW behind-the-scenes worker Andy Vineberg remembers the anxiety leading up to the event itself and what it was like working hand-in-hand with Paul Heyman at the show.
There was definitely a lot of anxiety going into it. Paul worked for this day, wanted this so very bad, and he could taste it, and he was hungry, and he wanted ECW to be seen by the masses more than anything else. But most importantly, to deliver a phenomenal show to show what ECW stands for and is all about.
Vineberg remembers how different Paul Heyman was on this night compared to a regular ECW arena event.
Paulie, before the show, was definitely nervous. He had something to prove. This was his dream at that time, to show that he could run a company and could get it to this point. He was definitely on pins and needles. He was a little more organized on this night than he was on other nights going into that. And when the show was over, he was smiling cheek to cheek. He was the happiest guy in the universe at that moment because he did it. He showed the world what ECW was all about.
Leading into that weekend, there was a lot of pressure on ECW. Could it handle a live television production? Could things go off without a hitch? Would things line up and align correctly when it came to the creative, when it came to the performance, when it came to the production? ECW's original founder, Tod Gordon, remembers the pressure the company was under leading into that fateful weekend.
The pressures for that weekend were astronomical. There were so many things to be concerned with. Everything from the arena being able to hold the power that we needed to get the pay-per-view up, which, as you saw at the end of the pay-per-view, we almost lost the entire end of the pay-per-view due to a power outage. The building was really tough to secure that way. In addition to that, just the pressure on the boys to perform. They felt as though this was their quote-unquote WrestleMania, and it was a WrestleMania moment, and the tightness of it all where they had to understand what a time factor meant, where we say 8 minutes, we mean 8 minutes and you're out. We don't mean 8 minutes, and if you have to go another 5, that's okay. There was pressures on all of us. I mean, every one of us. I don't think anybody slept much that whole weekend.
When the day came, April 13th, 1997, for Barely Legal, when everyone arrived, the ECW arena looked a little bit different. The building was completely painted over. There were brand new guardrails. There was a lighting truss hanging from the ceiling. This was not your mama's ECW. Tony Lewis remembers entering the building and how different it seemed.
I hadn't planned on going at first, and then Paul left me a message saying that we were so instrumental with the show being rescheduled that it would be fitting that I was there. So he comped me a ticket. I sat in the third row. I was very excited. The first thing I remember about walking in the building was the floor got a fresh coat of paint, and I said, "Man, this is really big time," And the truck lighting and all this. They're really doing it up, but still trying to keep that ECW underground Fight Club feel. And they were successful in generating that atmosphere, from the get-go.
Jeff Jones, who did not work the show on camera but was there as he was a referee for the company, remembers his thoughts on that day and the scene prior to ECW Barely Legal going on the air.
I mean, it's funny. Like, I was talking to somebody about it today. I was talking about the time that Balls broke my face with a steel chair, and I was like, oh, it happened a couple years ago. And then I go, oh, shit, it was 20 years ago. I said, because Barely Legal is 20 years old today. It was 2 months after Barely Legal. So it really doesn't seem like it was 20 years ago. It seems like, a year or two ago where me and Axel were driving up to Philadelphia like we always did for ECW events when we traveled together. And, it seemed big, but it didn't seem like it's definitely bigger now 20 years later than it was that day. Like that day, it just seemed like, hey, we're going on pay-per-view. No, I don't think anybody but Paul would say this, that I don't think any of us thought at the time that ECW was really shaping what wrestling would become with the Attitude Era and, with your Ring of Honors and all this. They're all spawned from ECW. And anyone who says differently, they're lying to you. So, I mean, maybe Paul thought back then, but I don't really, I don't know what was going on through his head other than, the speech he gave that night. But it was just cool. It was like, hey, we're going to a pay-per-view. And I was driving up pretty much knowing that I wasn't going to referee on the show because there was guys that were there much longer than me. Finnegan and Molyneux, Pee-wee, and Paul Richards. And I think, and you might correct me if I'm wrong, maybe there were only like 6 or 7 matches on the show. Yeah. So you really didn't need 5 referees. So I was totally cool with that, understood my spot, and, wasn't going to be too completely boo-boo faced if I didn't get to do the show. So we got there, and, walk in, and the ECW arena is, like, in pristine condition for back then. Like, the floor had just been painted, but there was, like, kind of like a buzz in the air. Everyone was happy. Everyone was giddy, about the fact they were going pay-per-view that night. They were there filming Beyond the Mat with Terry Funk, which is actually one of my bigger memories from the event, because I remember Louis Spicoli, who I was friendly with, grabbing me and was like, hey, let's hang out in the background, all these Terry Funk shots. We're bound to make this movie, whatever it is. A majority of the pre-show was spent palling around with Louis, just trying to get in background shots of when they were talking to Terry Funk, regardless of who he was talking to, regardless of where they were shooting. We would just try and walk in the background. But it was just different. You have a lot of guys who aren't around anymore that were part of the show. Dark match was Balls and Louis. I remember Axel being mad that why couldn't it be a tag match? But they already had a tag dark match, which I think was JT Smith and somebody against the FBI, maybe?
JT Smith and Shetty against the FBI.
Yeah. Which Taz was mad. Not Taz, which Axel was mad about because, well, why couldn't it have been me and JT? Why's Taz's cousin got to get on the show? That was kind of it for the pre-show stuff.
ECW ringside fan Charlie Adorno, who drove to every show from Staten Island, New York, remembers what it was like stepping into the ECW arena that night at Barely Legal.
Previously to the Barely Legal pay-per-view, the arena was never maintained very well. It had that bingo label, but it was really very much like a warehouse. Didn't even seem like a big-time place. Coming in that night and seeing the building painted up and clean and the walls done up and the banners hanging, it made it feel like a special thing for the fans. So, like, now we're here. This is us. Be ready to watch because we're going to be going, from here, getting bigger and bigger. Being in that arena always felt special, every show that was there. But being in the arena that night felt like we had made the big time, that we were going to be seen all over the world, and it was a big deal to everybody, to the wrestlers, to the fans, to the promotion. It just felt like ECW has arrived and was right up there with WWF and WCW.
Blue Meanie, himself from South Philadelphia, discusses what it was like the night before and the day of, leading into ECW's Barely Legal.
Nowadays, when you see every year that you see with WrestleMania, they have the Hall of Fame ceremony. And then, they always talk about, well, we're going to try to end this ceremony early. Everybody's got a big show tomorrow. And, well, back with ECW Barely Legal, we had that with the Terry Funk banquet. The night before we were putting Terry Funk, not essentially into a Hall of Fame, but we're having an appreciation banquet for Terry Funk, because without Terry Funk, there would be no ECW Barely Legal, because there wouldn't have been an ECW, because he helped put ECW on the map. So the night before at the banquet, we're just all a bundle of nerves, Joey Styles asked me if I wanted to say something kind about Terry, and I couldn't even think, because I was thinking about, the next night, and what do I say about Terry Funk? But then the next morning you wake up and it's the date has finally arrived for ECW Barely Legal, and just to get to the arena that you've gone to many a times, but it's a lot like the movie Wayne's World, where they sell their show to Noah's Arcade, but they get to the set, and we get to the ECW arena and the floor's freshly painted. There's a professional lighting ring above the ring, and there's a production truck parked right out front outside the building. It was so surreal, The only thing that kept it kind of normal was the fact that, the fans who normally camped out at 10 a.m. for every ECW arena show were still there in force, and they were chanting for the wrestlers as they entered the building. There was like this, it was like a sporting event. People were, tailgating out in front of the building for the pay-per-view. And then you get in, and it was so surreal that, here we are. We had made it, because it had been talked about for so long, ECW on pay-per-view. And then, it got shot down here and there. But finally, it almost didn't seem like it was going to be real until, they, do the final countdown. And then when Joey did the final countdown, and then we went live, it was monumental. It was cool to be a part of wrestling history.
Before one match would go to the ring, Paul Heyman would go to the back and address the troops. In a speech chronicled by Beyond the Mat, the excellent Barry Blaustein documentary about professional wrestling, which you can find wherever they still sell DVDs, you were able to hear Paul Heyman tell his crew to thank Terry Funk for all he had done for that company, and tell them that tonight was their night. This was the dance, as Heyman famously said. While we can't play that audio, it belongs to Universal Pictures. Sorry. We can give you Bubba Ray Dudley talking about the speech and how inspirational it was.
Paul's speech before the show was, completely inspirational. That wasn't the first time we had ever heard a Paul speech before, but that was the one that really, hit home. I always said that Paul is like the David Koresh of pro wrestling. He could talk his followers into doing anything that he wanted them to do. And Paul was a great motivator. He was a great boss, because he knew what to do and say to get you to go out there and perform at your peak level. There's only two ways you can reward a wrestler in the wrestling business. You can put an extra 0 on their paycheck, or you can give them a pat on the back. And Paul couldn't afford to give you the extra 0, but I'd be damned if he wasn't the first person on the other side of the curtain when you came back thanking you for that hard match that you just did. And then he would critique you. So his speeches, so motivational, completely full of shit at times, but insanely motivational.
Andy Vineberg talking about how riveted he was during that speech and the immediate aftermath.
You know, I'll never forget when Paul did his famous speech that appeared in Beyond the Mat that night. And here I am, I'm listening to that and surrounded by all these behemoths of ECW men and women who were part of the show. I remember the Dudley Boys. I remember Bubba coming over to me after that speech saying, I've got to hit a home run tonight. I've got to hit a home run tonight. Francine, nervous as could be, but again goes out and hits a home run. That particular night, everybody's on pins and needles. Paul was the Joel Osteen, the Tony Robbins that night, motivating the troops to go out there and declare war and show what you got. And then you have these individuals, including myself, and I'm just a behind-the-scenes guy. I didn't sleep the night before because I was so excited because of Barely Legal. I mean, this was the pinnacle of ECW at that particular time. And I have the opportunity to work behind the scenes and be a part of this. And I'm doing whatever Paul needs to be done to relay information to who I have to relay it to, whatever needs to be done. But to me, just the remembrance that I have of that particular event, Barely Legal, stands out as just everybody. It was all the quote unquote, and I don't mean this by any negativity, but the rejects, the guys that couldn't get into WWE or WCW at the time, the guys that were trying, that were on the cusp of making it, the Tazes, the Sabus, the Tommy Dreamers, the Rob Van Dams. Those guys had their moment that night, which skyrocketed them, not just to within ECW, but skyrocketed them to other companies as well, as history has shown.
Before ECW could go live on pay-per-view, they had a few matches for the fans live at the ECW Arena in Philadelphia. The first match on the show featured Balls Mahoney defeating Louis Spicolli after a chair shot. And then there was a tag match where one of Philadelphia's favorite sons, JT Smith, returned, surprising everybody as he teamed with Chris Chetty, the Extreme Rookie, to defeat FBI members Tommy Rich and Little Guido. This was originally planned to be a six-man tag. Mikey Whipwreck, who was already out with a knee injury and was going to work behind the scenes doing sound cues for the show, was going to come back and wrestle, but the third member of the FBI, which at the time was Tracy Smothers, was still under contract to the World Wrestling Federation and had been pulled from ECW's first pay-per-view to go work a European tour as Freddie Joe Floyd. Poor guy. Why was JT Smith back after leaving ECW just 6 months ago? ECW patriarch and original founder Tod Gordon explains.
We brought JT back just as a sort of a nostalgia thing. We thought that the arena would get a nice, warm, fuzzy reaction out of that and get them all kind of in a good sense and a good frame of mind before the actual pay-per-view began.
As it turned out, it would be JT Smith's last ECW appearance until June 2005 when he was brought in as a member of the FBI at the WWE-promoted ECW One Night Stand. 9 p.m. Eastern, ECW was on the air. Right before that, Joey Styles, as is tradition at the ECW Arena events, comes down to ringside to do an opening. Inside the ring, there's only one problem. The house mic is not working. No one can hear Joey Styles. With less than a minute to go on the air, the ECW audience in Philadelphia realizes this and begins chanting ECW in an attempt to try and cover when the show goes on the air. A microphone is rushed down the ringside to Joey Styles, tossed into the ring. Styles catches it with one hand, tosses the broken mic out, and as they go on the air, the microphone works. Joey Styles remembers the moment.
Wow, opening up the show live. I think what was going through my head was, oh my God, the microphone isn't working. So I'm going to have to be very loud. And of course, I believe a few words into my opening, the mic kicked in, but I believe I was so loud that people watching at home heard me because the building only sat, 1,000 legally, and who knows how many were in there.
As Styles began running down matches that viewers would see on the show, the Dudley Boys, Devon, Bubba Ray, Sign Guy Dudley, as well as Joel Gertner, came to the ring and interrupted. After sending Joey Styles from the ring, the Dudleys began cutting a promo, and ECW went into their opening montage, which for the first time featured a now classic ECW theme song, Harry Slash and the Slash Tones, This Is Extreme. Harry Slash explains how that song came to be and how it came to be featured on the ECW Barely Legal pay-per-view.
The song came about because Paul Heyman needed something distinctive to open up the first pay-per-view. He'd given me a few suggestions of what his dream songs would have been, and then I think I had about, 48 hours to come up with something. The true inspiration for the song was not what people think. People have associated it with White Zombie and Nine Inch Nails. The true inspiration behind the song was the theme from Jaws, with the slow build and the menacing tones. And we used it for Barely Legal. About a few weeks later, he started using it on the TV show. He replaced, the song was that the Pitbulls were also using. That was also the what they were using for the television show. So it was replaced on the television show a few weeks after Barely Legal and became the company's theme song.
The first official match featured the Eliminators defeating Bubba Ray and Devon Dudley for the ECW World Tag Team Championships. Bubba Ray Dudley remembers the match and an unfortunate injury that happened to him opening up the ECW pay-per-view.
Well, it was a very interesting time during ECW's first pay-per-view, Barely Legal. It was a real interesting time for the company, and it was a really exciting time for me and Devon. About a month before Barely Legal, me and Devon had won our first ECW Tag Team Championships. It was our first taste of being champions. It was our first taste of being pushed as a team. We were really hitting our stride. And, me and Devon, we were on top of the world. We were young guys who were getting our first opportunity. Little did we know that we were given that opportunity just to lose the belts to the Eliminators in match 1 of Barely Legal. But that, looking back on that match, it was a fun match. It was a great opening match for the pay-per-view and for the fans to get them going and, hit the ground running with the show. A bit bittersweet because I did shatter my ankle within the first 7 minutes of the match. I wound up finishing the match with a shattered ankle, took total elimination, and then got into the back. And I don't remember if I got into a hospital or if somebody drove me to the emergency room. Got into an ambulance, or if somebody drove me to the emergency room. But I, entire night of Barely Legal, having my ankle put in a cast, and I was able to get back to the ECW arena when they had just gone off the air and the generator had just blown up.
So that's really the highest of highs and the lowest of lows in a lot of ways.
Yeah, I mean, think about it. You're a young wrestler. The Dudleys had just been formed. We're going. We got this massive heel steam under our belts. We just won our first championship. We were just on our first pay-per-view, and then I shattered my ankle in the same show. So totally bittersweet. Like you said, so high and then so low.
As irony would have it, the Eliminators would be promoted as the best tag team in the world. Within several months, Perry Saturn would be off to WCW. John Kronos would stay with ECW before leaving that company. But meanwhile, the Dudleys, the team that had just won the belts the month before, in order to set up the Eliminators winning them back at Barely Legal, would go on to become one of the most celebrated tag teams of all time, winning major championships in every major wrestling company. New Japan, WWF, WCW with an asterisk because it was for WWE, ECW obviously, Impact Wrestling, and more. ECW Barely Legal was scheduled to feature Chris Candido against Lance Storm on the undercard. Leading into that show, Candido, who was one of Paul Heyman's lieutenants at the time, suffered a torn biceps, so was unable to compete. Rob Van Dam, who at that point had just completed a feud with Sabu and had been involved in the Sabu versus Taz feud, was not initially booked on the show, but was added to the show, defeated Lance Storm, and then cut a promo talking about how he was going to now make more money elsewhere based on his notoriety of winning here at ECW Barely Legal. We grabbed Rob Van Dam to ask him his thoughts on that moment, his thoughts on being a second-tier performer on that show since he was not initially booked to be on the pay-per-view, and how this moment helped springboard him into superstardom in the years to come.
Well, going into the match, Mike, I had a lot of resentment for the fact that I wasn't booked on the pay-per-view originally. It was ECW's first pay-per-view, as everybody knows, and so I felt like I was among the upper echelon, the elite best in ECW. Sabu told me we were the best, so it had to be true, and so I was a little pissed that they wanted to do they meaning Paul, obviously, wanted to do a pay-per-view and not have RVD on it at his first chance to show what ECW is all about. So I took that personally at that time in my career. So, at that time I had offers to go anywhere else, just like I always have since then. And maybe before that, I guess this might have been what started it all, an official offer I had from Eric Bischoff, face to face. He and I talked. He talked. I listened. He made an offer with some details on it. Everybody knew that because it was a internet reading fan base, as you know, your people, and so they all expected that I was going to go to WCW because that's what you did when you got an offer. You didn't stick out for the art form and what you believed in. You sold out, or you always wanted to go there, whatever. I was neither. I wanted to stay with ECW. So turned out that worked out good for me because before that match and with Lance Storm and at the promo afterwards, I was able to vent what I just told you about how I felt that I was looked over. Chris Candido got an injury of some sort, so he was sidelined, and then that got me booked. Then I had the position being on the pay-per-view, and the rest is history. That started the whole Mr. Monday Night angle.
To make the pay-per-view special, ECW brought in a six-man tag team match from Michinoku Pro Wrestling, known as Northeastern Wrestling in Japan, as the Great Sasuke teamed with Gran Hamada and young Masato Yakashiji to face Taka Michinoku, Men's Teo, a.k.a. Terry Boy, and Dick Togo. But how did Great Sasuke and all the other Michinoku Pro talents end up on an ECW pay-per-view? Sheldon Goldberg, wrestling historian who now promotes New England Championship Wrestling in the greater Massachusetts, New England area, was the catalyst for that, and we'll have him tell the story as to how this all went down, how he had to chase Paul Heyman down for a check.
It was an interesting weekend for sure. It all sort of came about as a sort of a happy accident. I had a visitor here from Michinoku, a guy who worked in the office. ECW happened to be in Revere, Massachusetts that weekend, and I brought him to the show. Paul not only introduced himself, but offered Sasuke and company the chance to be on the Barely Legal pay-per-view. So this kid goes back to Japan, and he calls me a couple of days later saying, "Hey, I'm going to see you again very soon." And I said, "Why is that?" He says, "Well, because Sasuke's decided to accept Paul's invitation. We're going to do Barely Legal. We're going to come over again, and you're going to handle the business for us." And I said, "Oh, okay, well, swell." So to fast forward a little bit to that particular weekend, they had made a deal, and I want to say it was for $20,000 for those guys to fly over and do the match. Paul was supposed to have sent them, I want to say it was either half the money or all the money in advance. He didn't. So I'm waiting for these guys in Philadelphia to arrive, and there's some question as to whether because Paul hadn't sent them the money. So the night before the pay-per-view, they had a banquet. I think they honored Terry Funk, if I'm not mistaken.
Correct.
Mike, you know that, right? So I'm running around. I'm trying to chase Paul down, and Paul says, well we're going to be, after this is over, I says, right behind you, because I'm not letting you out of my sight until I get that check. So he kind of laughed, and he says, look, I'll meet you later. I'll meet you in the hotel lobby. Here's the place. Here's the time, yada, yada. He showed up. He wrote the check, and Sasuke was coming anyway. It didn't matter whether he got it or not. He was doing it more for the publicity and for the enhancement of his reputation. They had the match, of course. The weekend kind of continued. The next day, some of the guys, the kids, they were like extremely excited to be there. You have to understand that, like, people like Taka Michinoku and Naniwa didn't make it, I don't think.
No, Naniwa was injured. It was
right.
Nakashichi.
He was injured. Right. Right. They were like little kids, because these were like, the equivalent of like independent guys in America. They were basically independent guys in Japan. They weren't making a hell of a lot of money except if they got a New Japan shot. So they were like little kids. They wanted to see Nitro, which was also in Philly that same weekend, that Monday. And I managed to get them in. And, of course, then Sasuke that same weekend on that Monday wanted to meet with WWF. So I arranged that meeting as well. But the whole atmosphere of Barely Legal was really something interesting. You kind of got the feeling that you were part of something that was really, really special. This was sort of the anti-corporate victory for anti-corporate wrestling in a world where corporate wrestling was rapidly taking over. And just to see, the company ECW, the little company that could, finally making it onto pay-per-view and so forth. It was a big deal for everyone involved. So it was a memorable experience for me and a memorable experience for all the guys who participated, especially the younger ones, because they knew that they were a part of something that was really more or less historical.
Of everything he called on the ECW pay-per-view broadcast, Joey Styles memorably remembers the Michinoku Pro Tag match most of all.
The match I remember most, I won't say if it's my favorite match, but the match I remember most was the Michinoku Pro six-man tag team match, because it's the one that I had to do the most prep for, because obviously I was intimately familiar with every other storyline and every other wrestler on the show, because I work with them week in and week out. And I had really never seen the six wrestlers from Michinoku Pro, so I had to rely on tapes to get myself familiar. I mean, I don't believe there was a Wikipedia back then, and there wasn't a YouTube, so I had to rely on tapes, and you were a huge help in giving me notes. I had to practice pronouncing their names correctly, and all the names of their moves and their background. And then the day of the show, they switched out, I remember they switched out one of the wrestlers. So I had to do a lot of quick research on him and get his name correctly. And it's really hard to interview Japanese wrestlers. I mean, obviously, if they have a translator, you can get some information. But through my whole career, I was able to interview English-speaking wrestlers who may have been doing a new style. Like I got to interview, Eddie Guerrero about Lucha Libre. I got to interview Rey Mysterio. I wouldn't call them interviews, just, an informal conversation where I could take notes ahead of time and ask them, are you going to be doing anything we haven't seen before? What is it called? And what is the origin? And what would you like mentioned? And there's a lot of prep work, that goes into calling a match properly if you care. And with somebody who doesn't speak English, you're relying on a translator, and Japanese is a much different language than English. So I just remember that match being the most difficult to call, and it was also one of the most fun.
Taka Michinoku, Dick Togo, and Men's Teo appeared as the international chapter of the Blue World Order. The Blue Meanie explains exactly why this happened at the ECW pay-per-view Barely Legal.
Well, the BWO went international for ECW's first ever pay-per-view because at the time we were doing a parody of the New World Order, and they were forming an allegiance with New Japan Pro Wrestling, and they were going international with the New World Order. It only made sense to get one of the top Japanese groups with Taka Michinoku, and Michinoku Pro to represent the Blue World Order over in Japan. So it was fitting to have an international flair on the first ever ECW pay-per-view with the BWO Japan.
In a match that featured fans throwing streamers into the ring in celebration of the Japanese talents before them, it was the Great Sasuke's team defeating the international BWO. But as always the case in professional wrestling, the story doesn't end there. Sheldon Goldberg, who helped facilitate Michinoku Pro Wrestling appearing in Extreme Championship Wrestling, actually had to go to court as he wasn't paid by the Great Sasuke. Sheldon explains.
He was supposed to pay, I won't get into the numbers, but he was supposed to pay me significantly more than he paid me. He sent me some money orders via the mail, and tried to get away with it. In fact, interesting story, Hiro Matsuda interceded on my behalf with New Japan. It cost him a couple of Tokyo Dome dates. And I had a friend who was an attorney that did a lot of international business, and he had contacts over in Japan. And as soon as I got a judgment here, I sued them in Massachusetts because that's technically where the contract had taken place. So I sued them and I won. And, a judgment theoretically is good forever. So once you have a judgment, you can go after them. And then the question was whether I could collect on it in Japan. So this friend of mine who had associates in Japan said, "Yeah, we'll just do it for the fun of it because we want to screw over a wrestling company who screwed somebody else over." So they took it to court in Japan, and they actually seized the gate on one of his shows, and he was like fit to be tied. But it's funny how when I tried to talk to him about it by phone, when he's over here, he kind of pretends like he doesn't speak English. But when they seized the gate, he called me in imperfect English. He started swearing at me. So it was pretty interesting. But it was quite an experience, and certainly one that I'll never forget.
As Barely Legal continued, the franchise Shane Douglas, with the head cheerleader Francine, faced Pitbull number 2 Anthony Durante in a grudge match where if Shane Douglas won the match, the masked man, who was obviously ravishing Rick Rude, would be forced to unmask. Rick Rude had come to ECW at the beginning of 1997 to help torment Douglas for breaking the neck of Pitbull Gary Wolf. Gary Wolf had come back and wrestled Douglas the month before, miraculously recovering from his legitimate broken neck, but was quote-unquote re-injured. Therefore, he had to watch the match from the front row. Douglas and Francine were indeed victorious, and Rick Rude came out claiming that he would give Francine something to remember and kissed Francine, only to later unveil that it was actually primetime Brian Lee under the mask. Francine was smitten by Lee, who would soon after leave ECW, so that storyline would not continue. But the original plan was for Francine to actually kiss Reggie Bennett, a female star who had worked in Japan and a number of women's promotions, who was brought in specifically for that spot. But when Brian Lee suffered an injury, they moved Reggie Bennett into a spot later on where she would interfere and attack Terry Funk during the main event, never to be seen again. Sometimes in ECW, even in ECW, not everything is explained. Francine was smitten by Lee, and then from behind, ravishing Rick Rude turned out to be one of the riot cops who were actually at ringside the entire time to quote-unquote protect Shane Douglas from the crowd. And Harry Slash, a.k.a. Harry Grivas, who was not only the composer of the This Is Extreme theme song, but also helped behind the scenes at ECW, has an interesting story to tell about how ECW at the last minute decided they needed riot gear and what some ECW staffers did to procure them.
Paul Heyman had a tendency of waiting to the absolute last moment to say, hey, I need this, that, or the other thing, like with the Al Snow heads, which we can save for another time. But we needed to hide Rick Rude, and the idea was to have him come out with bodyguards. It was a Sunday. Police supply stores are not open to go buy riot gear. We exhausted the phone book trying to find somebody that would open their store and sell us 3 helmets. So the late Debbie Beaumont, who was a big key, totally underappreciated for how important she was to ECW. Debbie, another gentleman by the name of Haz, and possibly, well, it's been 20 years, so the statute of limitations is up. Me, Haz, and Debbie basically drove around Philadelphia looking for motorcycle helmets that were unattended and basically slowly drive by, grab them out the window, and speed off. And then we spray painted them all black.
So ends justified the means then.
Yeah, basically, if you want to, say a misdemeanor theft, we needed it for pay-per-view, or else how could we hide Rick Rude?
What was Paul Heyman's reaction when he learned about how that all went down?
Plausible deniability. He wasn't told.
Aha.
Has actually said to him, okay, you can't ask any questions, but I have an idea of how to get them for you. And he was not told.
What are your...
I think he found out. He did probably found out afterwards. It's been a while. I don't remember. But Has had a tendency of, we called him the MacGyver of ECW. He would figure out solutions to these insane problems. And Paul didn't question his motives often.
As it would turn out, this would be the one match that would greatly fall below expectations, especially compared to great matches Durante and Douglas had the previous summer. It was one of the few miscues of the highest profile ECW event to date. Then it was time for the grudge match of the century. For 18 months, Sabu and Taz had been feuding without ever touching each other. They finally faced off after a year of Taz calling out Sabu at the 1996 November to Remember to one of the loudest reactions in ECW history. But before they could touch, the lights went out, and it would be another couple of months before Taz and Sabu would be signed and announced as the main event of record of ECW's first pay-per-view, Barely Legal. They were featured on the poster for the show, which left a number of people upset that they were not also featured on the poster. And Sabu and Taz went on to have a pretty good match, but they had a lot of pressure leading into it. Taz explains.
Well, there was a lot of pressure on both of Sabu and myself. We were not in a regular routine of doing live TV, so ending that match on time, budgeting the show as far as time was an issue that we wanted to make sure we didn't have an issue, I should say. And it was pressure, for sure, because no matter if someone liked it or disliked it, it was the last match, I believe, right?
Second to last.
Second to last? Okay.
Second to last, but you were the main event.
Right. So, but we had to make sure that, we didn't go over. We didn't want to, be disrespectful to anybody else on the card as far as time, because there was a run-in at the end of it and all this other stuff. So, there was definitely a lot of pressure. There was pressure leading up to it several weeks prior to it that both Sabu and I realized. I don't want to speak for him, but, I think he felt a little bit of pressure too. But I think we both persevered through the pressure. And frankly, it was, no matter how good or bad that match was going to be, there's no way it could have lived up to the hype.
Ringside fan Charlie Adorno discusses his memories of Taz versus Sabu at Barely Legal.
Personally, the build-up for Sabu and Taz for a year, culminating in a great match, was, my highlight. I wanted to see what they were going to do, who would win, and it was such a thing with ECW that it could have went either way, but the way it, the matches were booked and the way that was booked, specifically was awesome. Just sent chills up my spine waiting to see what would happen in that match.
As it turned out, in a bit of a surprise, Taz would choke out Sabu clean, ending their feud, or so it seemed. Taz showed respect to Sabu, but as it turned out, his longtime manager, Bill Alfonso, would turn on him, as Alfonso did not believe Taz was going to win the match and bet all his money on Sabu. Sabu showed respect to Taz, but then Rob Van Dam attacked Taz. Bill Alfonso showed his true colors And Sabu finally joined in, setting up the next stage of the Sabu-Taz showdown. How did Taz feel after the match was over? Easily at that point the biggest match of his career. Here's what he had to say.
Well, I was happy that it was behind us because it was a build-up for 1 year. So I was happy about that. I was happy with the match also. I feel that Sabu and I have had better matches in the past, but I understood that it was a little bit of a different situation, and it was, like we said earlier, a lot of pressure. It's live, you got to budget the time right, all this jazz, so you don't have as much freedoms. But I was happy with the outcome of how everything went, and it seemed like the people were happy, so I thought it worked out great. I felt a good sense of relief.
Sabu would remain with ECW until 2000, when he would have a falling out with Paul Heyman. He still wrestles on the independent scene today, although he's had a number of health issues. Taz went on to become the ECW World Champion, left ECW in late 1999, went on to have a nice run with WWE as a wrestler and then as an announcer, which he has then parlayed into his host as the leader of the Taz Nation on The Taz Show, which you can hear every morning on TazShow.com or on CBS Sports Radio's Play.it. Quite a long way from the dojos of Tasmania or Red Hook, Brooklyn. Take your choice. To set up the main event of Barely Legal, there was a three-way dance. Stevie Richards, the leader of the BWO, the ECW icon, the Sandman, doing his complete entrance to enter Sandman in full cigarette-smoking, beer-swilling glory, and the 53-year-old Terry Funk. The Blue Meanie, who cornered Stevie Richards alongside Hollywood Nova, a.k.a. Mike Bucci, that night, remembers the three-way dance from The Best Seat in the House.
My memories of the three-way dance between Stevie, Sandman, Terry Funk were chaos. The pay-per-view had gone a little bit long, and they were running out of time. And I remember distinctly Tod Gordon running around ringside saying, "They have to go home. We're running out of time." I'm looking over at Rocky, Bob Bartiz's brother, and he's frantically trying to signal to the referee to take it home. He has a pen in his mouth, the international signal for take it home. And I, tried to get as close as I can to say, "Hey, we're running out of time." And then eventually they do, Stevie takes it home. I mean, they eliminate Stevie, and then we go to the back, and then we're basically watching from the monitor in anticipation, hoping that the rest of the country gets to see the finish to the main event of our first ever pay-per-view, because a few years earlier, if you remember, UFC was having an event, and it was Dan Severn against Hoist Gracie, and in the middle of their main event of their pay-per-view, the feed went out, and I was watching it, and they just cut out, and I didn't get to see the finish to that pay-per-view. So here we are, a couple of years later. I'm in the locker room watching the main event of the first ever ECW pay-per-view, and the fans might not get to see it, which could be a company killer. I mean, I'm sure ECW would have still had our core group of fans, but the people who are watching because they had seen us on WWE television and seen us on Raw, and let's see what this company's all about, and then they don't get to see a finish of our pay-per-view, that could have killed us. So the fact that it all, it was just serendipitous that it just happened to finish on time, and 30 seconds of the finish of the pay-per-view, the generator blew, and all that power to the building went out. So it was just it was typical ECW fashion.
Stevie Richards remembers wrestling that three-way dance and compares it to wrestling on bigger shows later in his career.
Wow, even up until now in my career, after 26 years, I probably don't remember being anywhere near as nervous as I was that afternoon before the pay-per-view. Obviously I've been part of some of what's considered to be the biggest shows, WrestleManias and stuff like that, and performed. But that one, because I was actually in the match and in a pivotal moment of the pay-per-view where the winner went on to face Raven, and we were trying to elevate Terry to that, that old ultimate goal of him winning the ECW World Title. So it was a big responsibility, and to control the time in the match and all the other things that we didn't even know were going on. It was just, it was crazy. I know the famous story people tell about the transformer blew out like 10 or 20 seconds after the pay-per-view went off the air, which is like, it's pretty crazy to know that we came that close on the edge of success and failure, and we ended up launching to a better position, to a higher level after that pay-per-view. And it was great to be a part of it, and be picked to be in the main event.
As the three-way dance goes on, ladders are coming into play, barbed wire, crazy spots, and all sorts of madness. But the one thing that even ECW can't control is time, and time is rapidly running out. Jeff Jones recounts ECW frantically trying to go home during the three-way to set up the main event because they were running out of their allotted pay-per-view time, and if they had gone over, that would have been it for ECW.
They're running dangerously close on time with the three-way, with Stevie, Sandman, and Terry Funk, which it was funny because they're running down the time. Tammy Sitch, Sonny, whatever, she was on headsets calling times, and for whatever reason, they grabbed Dr. Mark, who was Raven's roommate at the time, and ECW's resident doctor. He was a podiatrist, but he was ECW's doctor. So, I mean, if you had a concussion, I don't know if you could cure it, but if you broke your foot, you were in the right hands. So they're scrambling because they're past the go home point for the three-way, but there's still time left in the show. But there was a lot of stuff to get in the Funk Raven match, and I remember Dr. Mark being sent to ringside to quote unquote check on Terry Funk and also give them the time cue of how much time they had left. Like, they're like, get the time cue to him, get the time cue to him. And I remember, I forget who was saying it. I want to say it was Paul, but I'm not 100% sure. It might have been Tod Gordon. Whoever was giving Dr. Mark the instructions, Mark just turns around and goes, "Hey, I saved lives." And then he went to the ring, gave him the time cue.
And as history would show, Terry Funk would pin the Sandman and move on to the main event, which had really no time left at all. The main event of ECW Barely Legal featured then 53-year-old Terry Funk, himself a former NWA World Heavyweight Champion many generations before, facing the then ECW World Heavyweight Champion Raven, after defeating Stevie Richards and the Sandman in a three-way dance to go on to get the championship match. The time of the pay-per-view rapidly running out. But before we get to that story, Tommy Dreamer tells the story of why he was mad he didn't get to wrestle on the ECW pay-per-view and his memories of commentating, sort of, with Joey Styles.
For the talent leading up to it, like, we all wanted to wrestle on it, and I remember I was pissed, and I was pissed as hell at Paul because I didn't wrestle on it. And when I found out I wasn't wrestling on it, I was really upset, and I had, won the right to wrestle in the main event a couple of months before, and then I gave up my number one contendership for Terry Funk, and I remember it was even Taz going to Paulie, like, "Brother, Dream is hot at you. How could you not have Tommy wrestle on the first ever pay-per-view?" And then when Paul finally sat down and explained it to me, and this is why, a lot of times wrestlers may think one way, but there's a bigger plan, and he was just like, Tommy Dreamer would give up his, shot so Terry Funk could have his last shot. And then I did. I totally got it. You would ask me about the choke slam. I don't want to really say it was a choke slam. It was more like Big Dick Dudley fell off the top stage. He wasn't known for his jumping ability. And but the night was great. I remember I hit a really sweet DDT that night, and just all the nervousness, passion, and all the, feeling of self-accomplishment once it went off the air was what ECW was all about.
Now, Joey's credited as being the guy who called the entire show by himself, but you were supposed to be the commentator, only you really didn't commentate. So tell the story behind that.
It was my first time ever being a commentator, and which I really like doing, but back then, I was always in that wrestler bubble, and I put the headphones on, and we didn't have like rehearsals. We had nothing. And I get up there, I put the headset on. I remember too, we didn't have enough microphones, and I don't have no clue why. Beulah was supposed to be up there with me too, and she was. And she became more eye candy than anything because we only had one extra microphone and extra headset. So Beulah, I think, just sat there, or maybe she had a headset, but it wasn't working. And so they were talking to me, and I get on, and they're like, Tommy, can you hear me? And I'm like, yeah, I can hear you. And all of a sudden, then they go, Tommy, everything you are saying is being broadcast live over the air. Do not answer us. And I went, okay. And then Paulie grabs the headset, and he's like, Tommy, stop talking. He goes, we're picking up everything that you said. So then I just stopped really talking, and I also told, as a color commentator, I also told Joey Styles to shut up and don't ask me questions because I was so into the match. Because basically I hadn't remember my spot. And so it was pretty awesome as well as pretty unprofessional, but it worked out at the end.
Here's Joey Styles' memories of these shenanigans.
I still kid Tommy about this because Tommy had never done announcing before, and he had a pair of headsets on. Of course, we were live for the first time, so it was his first time live. It was certainly my first time live. So Paul's in Tommy's ear and says, okay, your mic is hot. And Tommy says, okay, into a live microphone on a live broadcast. Yeah, of course, Tommy just out of his mind taking a choke slam, from the, I guess it was a perch. We called it the Eagle's Nest, but it was like a makeshift area with a little spiral staircase about the headset. But what I was also thinking in watching the three-way that led up to the match between Terry Funk challenging Raven is that I was so happy for Stevie Richards, because I always thought that Stevie could be more than a comedy act and more than just a Raven knockoff and more than just somebody wearing, Daisy Dukes and a half shirt. And I really think that night was Stevie's coming out party. And I think if he had been given more opportunities throughout his career, he could have been an even bigger star. But the fact of the matter is that regardless, Stevie's got a mind for tech and a mind for business, and he was always destined to do other things in his life besides wrestle anyway.
In the end, Raven threatened to chokeslam Terry Funk off of the Eagle's Nest where Tommy Dreamer and Joey Styles were doing commentary. Dreamer dared Raven to try as his minions were setting up a series of stacked tables under the Eagle's Nest. Behind Dreamer came Big Dick Dudley, quote-unquote, out of jail. It was supposed to be primetime Brian Lee, who Dreamer had feuded with, but Brian Lee had suffered a broken collarbone just a few weeks before in action for ECW and was relegated to the cameo under the mask, pretending to be Ravishing Rick Rude earlier in the show. Big Dick Dudley ended up in that spot instead, and Dreamer ended up chokeslamming, sort of, Big Dick Dudley off of the balcony before heading into the fray of battle, beating down the minions, interfering, and helping Terry Funk capture the ECW World Championship to end the pay-per-view in major climactic, can you believe in miracles fashion. However, if you look very closely, and I invite you to go look closely at this, you will see Commissioner Tod Gordon running around like the Roadrunner around ringside. Todd explains what was going on.
Well, I remember it was literally like maybe 2 minutes left and we were going dark, and they weren't even close to going home. So I came flying out from the back dressing room, ran around the ring, was trying to get the referee's attention, trying to get Raven's attention, trying to get Funk's attention, anyone's attention, as I ran around like my hair was on fire, what little hair there was. And ran around trying to making sure they knew I'm not kidding. We're now we're 1 minute, now we're 30 seconds. Go home, go home, go home, go home. My God, go home. And how they ended it just as they did it, Funk hit the audience and bang, we went off the air. It was a miracle. Everything about this whole company was a miracle, but that was definitely one of the miracles.
Tommy Dreamer remembers the chokeslam of sorts and takes us back to that moment and the immediate aftermath of ECW's first pay-per-view.
My choke slam of Big Dick Dudley, if you go back and watch it, wasn't really a choke slam. It was more like he fell off the stage. It was the worst choke slam ever, but it kind of worked. And then the best part about it was all the aftermath, and I still have the T-shirt that's soaked in blood after Terry won, and he was screaming forever. And, you know, there's a lot of cool pictures of me wearing that shirt. I believe it's a Clockwork Orange shirt, and I'm covered from head to toe in blood, and I just did the commentary, but that was all Terry Funk's blood. And if you ever talk about nervousness, passion, or everything that ECW represented of then becoming a success, it was that night. And I just remember everybody, it was a true embracement of, wow, we made it. We made it through our first hurdle. And it was a great, great night.
Ringside fan Charlie Adorno remembers Terry Funk winning the championship.
Well, as an old-time wrestling fan, I always loved Terry Funk. I always thought he was a great wrestler, a great NWA champion. But Terry Funk was the epitome of ECW. He was there right at the start in '92, all the way to winning the title. And Terry was the kind of guy that everybody got behind because he was the underdog. He was the older gentleman, and the fans just loved Terry. And he was one of our own. So having Terry win the belt was just made the fans so happy. And I personally loved seeing it.
The image of Terry Funk behind the scenes after Barely Legal went off the air remains a major memory emblazoned in the memory of Jeff Jones.
Terry Funk, bloodied, beaten, battered, and it's actually a scene in Beyond the Mat, which I watched recently. Him sitting there with a ice cold Coors Light after it was all said and done, getting bandaged up. Terry Funk winning the belt, getting to see Stevie go into a main event spot with the match with Sandman and Terry Funk, where the winner, went on to wrestle Raven. That, for as big as of a deal it was, Terry Funk's just getting bandaged up afterwards, drinking a cold beer. Tommy Dreamer choke slamming Big Dick off the Eagle's nest, that kind of stuff. They're the and the hodgepodge of people. Raven, he had Reggie Bennett with him, which was, I think, her only appearance ever in ECW. And again, it's one of those things, I don't know why. I think it was a Terry Funk thing. I think Terry Funk was friends with Reggie Bennett, but she had never been in ECW before, and I'm pretty sure she never was again. But she was there for Barely Legal and in Raven's flock.
Andy Vineberg remembers some of his favorite memories from Barely Legal.
The whole night was so amazing, and you don't realize how big it is when you're there, but looking back, it's such a huge moment, and everything was big that night. Just the fact to be a part of this, the Japanese match was great. Terry Funk winning the championship was great. When Rick Rude took the helmet off and revealed to be Ravishing Rick Rude was great. The Sabu and Taz finally meeting one against the other is happening right before your eyes, before the fans and broadcast lot. There's so much. It's the whole event because it's a team effort, as you know, Mike, and putting them all together under one roof on that night was just awesome.
While it's great to reminisce, let's not forget that ECW that night came within seconds. They were this close to going out of business. The generator powering everything in the building went out and didn't come back. What would have happened if that generator had blown just minutes before? Seconds before ECW went off the air. 3 seconds before Terry Funk scored the pin. Tod Gordon tells us how severe the situation this really could have been.
Had it gone off any time at all prior to when it did, we were out of business. The company would have gone under. When did I find out it went off? I found out when the building went dark right at the end of the pay-per-view. And we couldn't get the lights back on. We all sat there with lighters and candles.
Bubba Ray Dudley ended up missing most of the pay-per-view, sitting in the emergency room getting his ankle fixed, but still gives us a memorable memory of the Funker.
I have a lot of fond memories of Terry Funk. Unfortunately, I don't have any memories of that evening because when Terry Funk was in the ring wrestling for the ECW Championship, I was in an emergency room getting my ankle put in a cast. Funk was incredible for ECW. Funk gave ECW credibility. Terry Funk was the perfect veteran for the ECW locker room because he understood us better than anybody else. If you listen to Paul speaks about the dance, he specifically says, thank Terry Funk, because Terry Funk's name, his legacy, his stardom is what helped get ECW there. I don't have a story about that night, but my favorite Terry Funk story in ECW, or at least one of my favorite Terry Funk stories in ECW, is the night that he got burned by Cactus Jack in the infamous flaming chair incident. And, we were all backstage in the locker room, and Funk came in the back with second or third degree burns, and he was cursing and yelling and screaming and throwing things all over the place. ECW for about a month. I tried to get as far away from Terry Funk as I possibly could. Somehow he just kept walking straight towards me. He eventually got so close, and I believe I just said, "Sir, are you okay?" And he smacked me in the face for no reason. And all I know is I was so excited that I got smacked in the face by Terry Funk.
Taz gives his own unique take on the generator blowing and points out his immediate response when he found out, which in the days of WCW and WWF going to war with just about everybody and each other, you never know.
I remember it. I remember after hearing about it, I was so much zoned in my own world, even after the match, that it didn't really rent a lot of space in my head. But then I heard about it. To be honest with you, I was just like, thank God I'm done. So that's the truth. That's what I thought. I'm glad Sabu and I got our match in, because that would have been horrific. But then after, because we were several of us back then were full of conspiracy theories, and I started thinking, oh man, did somebody sabotage us here? Did someone, pull the plug on us? That's what I started to think, to be honest with you. But I was a little crazy back then.
When ECW Barely Legal went off the air, inside that building, it was like Mardi Gras, the Super Bowl, the World Series, and New Year's Eve had all happened at the same time. It was probably the biggest collective sigh of relief and exhilaration in South Philadelphia history. Charlie Adorno remembers what it was like from the first row.
As soon as the pay-per-view ended, it was just like a sigh of relief almost that, wow, what a great show that, the world has just seen, and everybody in the building was just so elated that it came off so well. All the wrestlers were happy, the fans, the promotion. It just made it feel like, wow, we just did and saw a great show that, will never be duplicated. It was the first time ECW had done a pay-per-view, and it just was the ultimate, spectacular. It was great to have it there in Philadelphia, the home of ECW. Well, first off, for me to have been there was awesome because I was going to ECW when it first started as Eastern Championship Wrestling, when it was in bars and just some local schools in the Philadelphia, Pennsylvania area. So to be on that journey with them for the 5 years, going to every show I could in Philadelphia, Jersey, and New York, it just was the ultimate build-up. And getting to that point, it just made me as a fan happy to see where the promotion had started in front of maybe 30 people to being on pay-per-view was just, what I would always wanted to see happen with the company, and how it grew. It was awesome.
Tommy Dreamer was literally standing in the front row when ECW went off the air, cheering on his mentor, Terry Funk, who had just won the ECW World Championship. His remembrances of that moment after ECW went off the air.
It was a great magical feeling. And like I said, and hey, you were there too. It was a feeling of accomplishment, a feeling of self-pride, and it was everyone working together. And when I say everyone, I mean all the fans. And, I've told you this. I, at one point, pretty much knew, every fan that was there. If I didn't know their name, I, remembered them. And I still have that craziness where I remember people. But we all felt like we overcame this gigantic obstacle, because in reality we really did. And Terry just screaming, we did it. And his, I don't know if you remember, but his family was there. His daughters were there. His wife was there. Barry Blaustein was there filming stuff. It was a magical time.
As ECW fans were jubilant and cheering on Terry Funk and excited that the little promotion that could had actually completed a live broadcast, much less a pay-per-view, without a hitch, little did they know the generator blew just seconds after ECW went off the air, showing just how close ECW came to falling apart that night. ECW director Ron Buffone remembers the immediate moment after the ECW pay-per-view went off the air.
Well, the miracle part about it is the show is about 5 seconds after it went off the air, we lost the generator and we lost power. Where if we would have lost that power, imagine at the finish of the show, we probably would have never been on pay-per-view ever again. We would have lost it all. So call it God, call it whatever. We certainly made it off the air clean, but I can tell you it was a feeling of accomplishment, of something that we knew that we arrived, something that we knew that the product was capable of sustaining, that we were worthy, beyond worthy of being on a pay-per-view. And we knew that we had the best product out there. We knew we had the best crew out there. The boys were amazing. The talent that was out there, the booking, it was just an amazing product that we knew that the fans supported. As a matter of fact, we never would have been on pay-per-view if it weren't for the fans haunting the pay-per-view and the powers to be. It was the fans that this was a fan-base driven product, and it was the fans that got us there, and it was the fans that we were always loyal to with the product. And that's how come it was that synergistic play between the both that we gave the fans the best possible experience, and the fans appreciated so much that they went to bat for us to get us where we were supposed to be.
Harry Grivas, a.k.a. Harry Slash, was on the production stage when the show went off the air. Here's his perspective on the final moments of the show and the immediate aftermath.
As if everybody exhaled all at the same time. We were holding our breaths. There was problems with the power before the pay-per-view even went on the air. There was the timing factor, the fact that we didn't have the clout with the pay-per-view company to run overtime, so the show had to finish at the exact 59-second mark. And Tod Gordon running around, screaming, telling them to go home. They do the thing, 1, 2, 3, Terry Funk gets in the crowd, the close-up shot of him with the belt, 3, 2, 1, we're off the air, and 10 seconds later, the power truck went out, and we lost all signal. The moments after it went off the air, the memory I have was Joey Styles running to the stage because he was up in the gorilla position above the entranceway, if you remember calling the show, coming onto the production stage and almost collapsing in tears from being the first guy to ever call a live pay-per-view completely on his own, the fact that it went off as it did. I saw Paul Heyman exhale for the first time in 3 days as if he'd been holding his breath, because it really was sink or swim with that show.
Tod Gordon's memories of the immediate aftermath.
I just remember hugging Paulie. Maybe tears coming down out of our eyes a little bit. Like we got there, we did it. Thank God the generator didn't blow. Look at this place, how much they appreciate everything. The fans were so incredible that night. They were just so much a part of everything we were doing that night. And when it was all over, no one left. I mean, it's a Sunday night. It's 11 o'clock. No one left the building. It was amazing. It was such a feel-good atmosphere.
Stevie Richards remembers the aftermath of Barely Legal ending.
It was pretty emotional. Everybody was emotional, and it was just one of those feelings of relief. It wasn't like we knew it wasn't just another show. And, actually at that time, any show we did was pretty special. But that because it was our first exposure before 2 a.m. to the world. So it was pretty neat. And after that, obviously it was just, big stuff for ECW, pay-per-views regularly, going to different towns, doing those pay-per-views. I wasn't a part of those, but they ended up, we were pretty hopeful, and having hope in the wrestling business is kind of hard to come by, and everybody had a ton of it after that pay-per-view.
Andy Vineberg remembers being on cloud 9 in the aftermath of Barely Legal going off the air.
When the show was off the air, I happened to be standing right next to Paul Heyman. And I'll never forget, before the generator going off, it just went off the air. Terry Funk's the champion. The place is going wild. Paul jumps over to me, and he just grabs me. I'll never forget it, and squeezed me with this hug. And it was like a sense of relief. And then he went to the different guys in the locker room that fought for him and with him to get to this point. And I remember him just hugging these guys and being on cloud nine, then going out there when the generator went off. And the timing was impeccable as to when that happened, because here we are. They just broadcasted this phenomenal pay-per-view, which was a great show. And then it just shuts down at that moment. So I think God was on our side.
Perhaps one of the funniest and most emotional stories coming out of the aftermath of that pay-per-view is the journey of Joey Styles as he left the commentary booth and sought out his then-fiancée, Janice.
The most memorable part of Barely Legal for me is probably what happened when Barely Legal went off the air. So leading into the pay-per-view, there was a lot of drama behind the scenes. The pay-per-view almost didn't happen because of complaints from people of some other incidents. And as it was, only one of the two pay-per-view companies was broadcasting the pay-per-view. They insisted on it starting at 9 o'clock at night instead of 8 o'clock at night. Paul and I had some negotiations going into the pay-per-view. So all of that's gone, get through the entire show, which was make or break for me because it was my first time ever on live TV, and it was either going to work out and this was going to be something I was good at and that I could do, or I was going to crash and burn on live television, and that would be the end of my career. So it worked out, and it was over, and it was very emotional, and Terry Funk won the ECW World Heavyweight Championship, and we go off the air, and for the first time in my life, I'm crying tears of joy and relief, and I had never cried in that way before. And I'm walking down the spiral staircase, and I'm trying to walk my way through the crowd, and everyone's high-fiving and hugging me because we're really all part of the same team, the ECW fans and all of us who worked in front of and behind the camera. And I'm working my way through the sea of fans, and I'm looking up to where the hard camera is. That's the camera that shoots directly at the ring. And I see my fiancée, Janice, who's now she will be my wife of 20 years, come this August. And I can see her, and I'm working my way, and I'm weaving, and I'm pushing, and it's like at the end of a big bowl game where the fans are on the field, and I finally get there, and I get to the bottom of the steps, and I walk up the steps, and I'm crying, and she's crying, and I open up my arms to give her a big hug, and Paul Heyman steps right in front of her. He had no idea she was there, and I wasn't looking at him either. And he's crying, and he gives me a big hug. So the biggest and perhaps the only laugh of the night came when Paul unknowingly stepped in between my emotional fiance and myself. And he told me he loved me, and I told him I loved him too. And, had it not been for Paul giving me that opportunity, I may have never had a career. And the truth of the matter is, if ECW Barely Legal was the only thing I had ever done in my career, I would be happy to hang my hat on that. It was fun, and I think I put in a solid performance that night.
There was no denying that being on pay-per-view and even getting the show accomplished changed Extreme Championship Wrestling forever. Taz weighs in on how the show changed ECW.
Well, I think that working at pay-per-view changed ECW because it put us on the map of doing a live big pay-per-view, that we could do this, that we were not just some Bush League territory, little junky bingo hall promotion. It showed that we could bring it with a bigger reach, and that's what we had with this pay-per-view. We had a bigger reach as opposed to our normal reach with our TV. So, at that time, in that era, companies like WWF and, WCW were doing pay-per-views and all these big shows, and we're doing live Mondays, all this or whatever, and, we didn't have the opportunity to be live. So, we wanted to bring our own brand of, wrestling to the masses because we knew we were reaching to a bigger audience. So in that regard, I think it helped accentuate and give more brand awareness to to ECW and that we have arrived. And I also think it helped galvanize the brand with some of the people in the bigger companies at that time that had their nose in the air, like they were the Cats Meow and we were just a bunch of Bush League guys. I think they had to realize, wow, these guys not only had a pay-per-view, they pulled it off and it worked.
Bubba Ray Dudley chimes in on how ECW was changed by Barely Legal and how ECW changed wrestling forever, which will lead us into our final chapter, looking at the legacy of Barely Legal itself.
I think it changed ECW because everybody had to take us seriously after that. I mean, we all know today that ECW changed the wrestling world. Just like Napster changed the way we listen to music, ECW changed the way we view pro wrestling. I've said it a million times. ECW was the Napster of pro wrestling. Did Napster go out of business? Yes. Did they change music forever? Yes. Did ECW go out of business? Yes. Did it change wrestling forever? Yes. ECW leaves behind the legacy of being the birthplace of the Attitude Era. ECW's legacy is the adult-oriented, in-your-face brand of wrestling and sports entertainment that garnered the highest ratings in the history of professional wrestling. Without ECW, there is no Attitude. I mean, Stone Cold Steve Austin will tell you himself how much he borrowed from the Sandman. And some of those guys from the Attitude Era will tell you how big of a fan they were of ECW at the time. There are two kinds of wrestler in this world. They're the ones that are jealous that they weren't in ECW, and they're the ones that are really fucking jealous that they weren't in ECW. To this day, people chant ECW in arenas around the world. They don't chant WCW. They don't chant AWA. They don't chant Smoky Mountain. They don't chant UWF. They chant ECW. And it's been dead for over 15 years. There's a reason why they do it.
When one looks back on a huge milestone such as a 20-year anniversary, you have to wonder what the legacy is. So what is the legacy of ECW's Barely Legal beyond just some fun wrestling matches and a cool couple of hours where something was different in the world of professional wrestling? Historian Sheldon Goldberg, promoter of New England Championship Wrestling, ponders the question for us.
Wow, interesting question. It's a very difficult one to answer because as much as it was sort of a strike against corporate wrestling, it sort of infused the spirit of independent wrestling now. I think I know myself as a promoter, it was very inspired by ECW and the success that it had. That you didn't have to be a big corporation with tons of money to do something that made an impact. So I think that legacy has really lasted over the years, but not so much in the upper tier of things, but it's really taken hold in the independents that followed.
Perhaps it's most fitting to ask this question of the man who originally formed ECW, Tod Gordon. Here's what the commish had to say when I reached him on the phone at Carver W. Reed.
I think the legacy just is the fact that the little engine that could did. That was perhaps the greatest show we ever did or even close to it. But it was the culmination of we can do it together with you guys. You help us, the fans writing in, calling and trying everything they could to get us there, us trying to get there. It was just like, oh my God, it's the next level. We got there. We did it. We came up with the funds necessary. We did everything we had to do to make that thing work. And it was torturous, but that was like a joint effort between us and the fans. And that's what makes that so memorable to everyone today.
20 years later, Andy Vineberg, who worked behind the scenes for ECW and in front of the camera as a timekeeper, talks about what ECW Barely Legal's legacy means to him.
To me, I'll take it a little bit of a personal level, behind the scenes, as one of the right hands to Paul Heyman. ECW's Barely Legal means to me what hard work is all about. I don't have a lot of wrestling memorabilia or posters hanging up in my house. But the one poster that as you walk down my basement, the first thing you see is that ECW poster of Taz and Sabu. And that picture to me reminds me every day of years of hard work, sweat, blood, tears equals this particular moment. If you work hard enough, you can achieve your goals. And that was the first goal, the first hump for ECW to get to the next level.
When posed with a question about the legacy of Barely Legal, even the voice of ECW, Joey Styles, finds himself a little tongue-tied.
Wow. That's heavy. I hadn't even thought of that. I probably should have. The legacy of the show 20 years later. I think the fact that we even got on pay-per-view to begin with is huge, because remember, we never had an office. There was no office. I worked out of my house on digital media and the 900 numbers. Paul worked out of his house. The production was done out of somebody else's house. Our pay-per-view distributor, who was in charge of our media, worked out of his place. So the fact that this company that didn't have a physical address was able to get on pay-per-view was the big victory. And then the fact that we were able to put on such an entertaining show and do it our way is the legacy. I guess it's that in wrestling, anything's possible. And we've seen many more examples of that, many more extreme examples of that, pardon the pun, over the last 20 years. But anything is possible in wrestling.
Tony Lewis, perhaps one of ECW's most ardent supporters, thinks about what the legacy of ECW Barely Legal is for the company and for himself personally.
The legacy of the show, really for me, is that it brought so many people into my life that to this day, I really love and care for. As far as the company goes, the legacy of Barely Legal, the legacy of Barely Legal is really tied with the legacy of ECW. I think that you can't really separate them. I mean, ECW changed the business to this day, and 20 years later, those three letters still mean a whole hell of a lot.
The Blue Meanie, Brian Heffron, lives in South Philadelphia. He could walk to the 2300 Arena as it's now known today. So, Barely Legal, very important to him. It was right in his neighborhood. What does he think of the legacy of the show 20 years later?
I think the legacy of Barely Legal 20 years later is, we went from being the little engine that could to the bigger company that could to, hold on, let me start over. I think the legacy 20 years later of ECW Barely Legal is the fact that you can do anything you set your mind to. ECW was a small company that was running bar shows once a month on Market Street in Philadelphia at Mike Schmidt's Sports Bar. And then eventually it graduated to running a show at a college and doing TV tapings. Then we were fortunate enough to find the ECW Arena. And then, from ECW Arena, then they did the show Night the Line Was Crossed, which brought the first legit over 1,000 people into the company. So we go from doing that to having our hottest, period between 96 and 97. Can we do, pay-per-view? Can we survive? And I think it was, overall, the show was a really solid show. It didn't have the fancy, the quick style editing, that, Paul and Ron and Charlie were producing the studio. But it was more of a raw, no pun intended, or maybe even like an unplugged feel to how it was to be in the ECW Arena that night. The ECW hardcore TV shows were like a sizzle reel of what it was like to be in the ECW Arena, where you're watching Barely Legal, you're seeing live as it happens, bumps and bruises, and scars all together, It was an unpolished version of ECW, but it was still ECW nonetheless, and I think it still holds up fairly well 20 years later.
The Human Suplex Machine main evented ECW's Barely Legal. What does the legacy of that show mean to Taz?
I think the legacy of Barely Legal was we had a gun to our head, and we dodged the bullet in a positive way, because there were so many things that could have went wrong in that show, and it didn't. Things went right, and we pulled it off. So I think I think it really cemented and helped advance the evolution of Extreme Championship Wrestling. And it was a chapter, it was a steeple that it was a hurdle that we had to get over. And I think we got over that hurdle and then on to the next one, the next one, the next one, the next one. So I think that was important because it was the first of several pay-per-views, as you know. So I think that was a big deal for us.
Rob Van Dam, who, as we already noted, was not even initially scheduled to be on the show, but helped use it to springboard himself into being a main eventer, not just in ECW, but a future WWE champion, talks about his own unique take on the legacy of Barely Legal.
Well, Larry Flint has a strip club named after it. It was the start of the ECW pay-per-views, which we had quite a few. I don't know how many, but we're all very proud of them because we had such a different product, and we were all such different artists and with different expressions than the mainstream wrestling. So I guess, it launched that up. Besides that, I think that for me, Barely Legal will go down in my mind as what we just talked about. I was also in a very self-absorbing kind of position in life and in my career back then, so I couldn't even tell you what was on the rest of the card.
Ron Buffone talks about how emotional the legacy of ECW is to him personally, especially when speaking about Barely Legal.
I will tell you this, though, that even 20 years later, that night is still overwhelmingly emotional for me, and I think everyone involved. We all get choked up talking about it, and even at the beginning of this conversation, can you believe it's been 20 years since that pay-per-view? 20 years. It's been incredible.
Stevie Richards, who that evening wrestled what was the biggest match of his career up until that point, closes us out with thoughts on the legacy of ECW's Barely Legal 20 years later.
It still holds up. It still holds up as, I think, one of the best pay-per-views out there. And, people can criticize ECW for what it is, but we proved with that pay-per-view, just like all the other shows, that we were that variety show. You did get your hardcore wrestling, but also you got your, you got MMA, an MMA kind of hybrid thing between Sabu and Taz before it was kind of popularized. You got Story, Raven, Dreamer, and then all across everybody crossing through that. Me, Sandman, the BWO, the Japanese BWO for entertainment. There was everything in that show. And actually, when I put it up today, because I didn't even realize it was 20 years until someone tagged me on Instagram. I put up on social media, and a lot of people who commented talked about the promo I did during the show, and I totally forgot about it, but it did, because it was 100% real, and it was really me, Michael Manna talking about my experiences in my life, and to this day, people tell me about that promo and how it kind of it still resonates. So the promo, the matches, the show overall, WWE Network put up a Barely Legal Revisited, I think, right? They put up a special on it.
Mm-hmm. Complete collection of TV matches leading up to it.
I didn't know that. I don't subscribe. Sorry, Vince. But yeah, that's cool. I think people always kind of talk it down. And once again, we're going to get in that point where there's going to be those people that say it was just nothing but garbage wrestling, nothing but hardcore wrestling. It was bullshit. I'm sure you heard it all from Cornette. But, there's other people that it really signifies, not just for the wrestlers, but the people that watched it. And then they can show their kids some of this stuff, hopefully not all of it, but some of it, and say, this is what I grew up watching, and it can be something that can be passed on.
Well, with that said, that's going to close out this documentary-style look at ECW's Barely Legal. I actually started working on this just 24 hours ago, so I want to thank everybody that was nice enough to give me some time with very little notice, and I want to thank those of you who are listening to this. I've worked really hard to get this up by the end of April 13th. Perhaps if I ever do another one of these, I should plan them out about 6 months in advance. But in closing, ECW was special to me. It was special to this website. Without ECW, I would not know Dave or Epps or anybody else, and you certainly would not know of Mike Johnson. So I want to thank ECW and everybody that worked there, and I want to say there's a number of people that worked for this company who are no longer with us. Take a moment and think about them, and if you've never checked out ECW before or never really thought it was your cup of tea, maybe give it another chance. Hopefully some of these stories will interest you and make you want to go back and check out Barely Legal, which really does hold up as one of my favorite shows of all time. And that's why I did this, because last night I sat there and I said, wow, 20 years. Someone's got to commemorate this. And then I said, we should be doing this. And then I went, I guess I better start working. So hope you enjoyed it. Feel free to send me feedback, good or bad. I'm sure it's not perfect. It was turned over real quick. Mike Johnson, pwinsider@gmail.com. Thank you for your support. You guys and gals are the best. And until next time, stay extreme. I don't know. Bye.